you have traveled extensively in both China and the United States, and you have described that the relationship between China and between the two countries is complex and multidimensional. And could you explain how this complexity can potentially contribute to improving the U.S.-China relations?
Sure. Well, that's a terrific question. I think one of the real problems in the U.S.-China relationship right now is that the relationship, the public face of the relationship has been dominated by a small number of voices who are very, very loud. And it's in the interests of these voices who have particular positions to push to emphasize, to overemphasize particular elements of the relationship. So, for example, there are people in political life in the United States who are arguing that China is pursuing a strategy of a global domination and point to things like the Belt and Road Initiative and say clearly this shows us that China is an expansionist power. The reality is that the Belt and Road fits into a much larger context. It is many things, but one thing I think it's safe to say it is not is a strategy to allow China to overtake the United States as world leader. One of the consequences of this kind of echo chamber in which a few voices become extremely loud and overpower other voices is that many other dimensions of the relationship get forgotten. And so I think to answer your question most directly, when people think about the complexity of the relationship, they are more likely to recognize the importance of the relationship working. That is to say, more likely to see the consequences, the negative consequences for their own society, for them personally, for the world of tension in the relationship. So to put this in a very clear example, because of the trade relationship that has emerged between China and the United States over the last 30 years, and especially since WTO accession, American consumers enjoy much cheaper access to world-leading tech goods than they otherwise would. It's one thing to say China is engaged in a long-term strategy to overtake the United States, but when you realize that long-term, whatever China's strategy is, China's engagement with the U.S. is what enables you to have an iPhone. So that's just one example. There are many, many others we can think of. I just want to mention very quickly two. The first is to recognize that China's relationship with the United States is a relationship that involves hundreds of thousands, millions of people who move between the two countries or who trace their origins to the other country. There are millions of Chinese Americans, millions of American citizens of Chinese descent who have been under a lot of pressure, under a lot of strain in light of the deteriorating relationship, who have been victims of anti-Chinese racism, despite being American citizens. So recognizing that there are victims to a tense relationship is a second element where I think complexity, attention to complexity, helps us realize the seriousness of the problem. And then third, finally, is that for better or for worse, the United States and China are the only countries that can take the lead in solving global challenges, the challenges of public health. And for me, the one that really overwhelms all others is climate change. If deteriorating U.S.-China relations slows the path to a climate-sustainable global economy, that is a terrible, terrible crime that we will be committing for future generations.
Thank you for that insight. And as a historian, that you have a deep understanding on the Chinese kinship. And in March, you mentioned that both China and the United States are struggling with the history. And how do you think a historical perspective can provide a different lens to improving the U.S.-China relations?
Well, so I'm going to answer that question in two ways. The first is that in the political rhetoric in both China and in the United States, history is often deployed as a political tool. So people use historical arguments to justify certain political positions. We heard recently an American political leader talk about China's 1,000-year campaign to overtake America. And obviously, so from a historical point of view, it's nonsense. Is he saying that the political elite of the Song dynasty was trying to overtake America, which did not yet exist? So, one thing to know about when you know a little bit more history is that you realize that you're able to critique historical arguments because they are simply wrong. But you can also critique historical arguments that are one-sided. So a good example of this is a concept that is growing in influence within China, which is the notion of the 百年国耻, the 100 years of humiliation. But the reality is that that's only one version of a story which is much more complicated. To give just one very clear example of how the story is more complicated, among the foreign things, the foreign phenomenon that entered China in this so-called century of humiliation was Marxism, was Marxism. The interaction between the West and China over the last 100 years has been much more complicated than simply a story of imperialism and oppression, without in any way limiting the impact of imperialism on China. So the second reason why I think history can help us think productively and creatively about U.S.-China relations is to recognize that even in the last 70 or 80 years, U.S.-China relations have undergone very, very profound shifts. From a 20-year period where the two countries were basically had no relationship, except to the extent that they actually were at war with one another through proxies in Korea and later in Vietnam, through remarkable political leadership in the early 1970s. The relationship was able to undergo a dramatic transformation. When Kissinger went to China, when Nixon went to China, no one imagined the degree of entanglement and engagement and coupling that would then result. We then saw 30, 40 years of gradually and then more rapid integration between the two societies, massive increase in the engagement between the two societies. We're now seeing a turning of the cycle. But I think attention to history lets us realize that while the challenges that face U.S.-China relations today are to some degree structural, they're not inevitable. And history tells us that even tense relationships can be transformed through political leadership.
And I want to ask you a little bit about an observation that I got when I arrived here.
Yeah.
So when I got off the airplane and when I got on the Uber drive, and the driver was asking me, so I heard that there's a China zombie virus going on, and he was just seriously asking me, are you from China? And do you think, is there really a zombie virus in China? And do you think that the American public that starting to have more, stereotypes and misunderstanding towards China after the COVID or like during the COVID?
Well, I think the cutting off of person-to-person ties during COVID is a big problem. I'm not sure how to explain why your Uber driver thinks there are zombies in China. That is pretty shocking. I almost wonder if he was making a joke at your expense. I don't know if we'll ever cure the problem of misinformation. The one thing I'm sure is that having more journalists having access to our countries, reduction through Chinese policy of the number of journalists, foreign journalists, American journalists in China, clearly has a negative impact on popular perceptions of China. I don't know if the restoration of journalism, if the restoration of studies, of exchange students, if the restoration of tourism will solve problems like your Uber driver, but it certainly is a step in the right direction.
Right. You have both studied and lived in Taiwan and the Chinese mainland. So given your experiences, what potential approaches do you see for resolving the current tension, the high tension in the Taiwan Straits?
Well, that's a very tough question. So two thoughts here. The first is that the relationship between the mainland and Taiwan has been extremely productive over the last 40 years. Taiwanese investment has had a massive impact on reform and on the success of reform and opening up. Without Taiwanese investors having the confidence to invest in the mainland, the course of reform and opening up would have been very, very different. So the first point to note is that policymakers should be very careful about undermining that successful relationship. I think that it should be clear to everyone, and this actually gives me a little bit of optimism about the relationship. It should be clear to everyone that an invasion or any kind of political compulsion would destroy that successful relationship. It would have many other consequences as well. I think it would frankly be terrible for China. But focusing in on Taiwan, it would destroy that productive relationship. And so I think that that's a reason for caution. And that actually makes me a little bit optimistic. Second point I would make is that we hear I hear a lot now from Chinese colleagues and Chinese thinkers on the Taiwan issue that Taiwan and the mainland are brothers. And so brothers they're part of the same family. I think that as someone who works on kinship, as you mentioned, that's an interesting argument to be made. But one of the messages I think my work on kinship and the family in China teaches me is that there can be all kinds of families, and families can have all kinds of relationships. Singapore is a majority Chinese community. I think the people in Singapore recognize their Chinese heritage. Many of them would say they are brothers with China. But it's a brotherhood that takes a very different form than political reunification. And so I think recognition of the possibilities that there are different ways of constructing a Chinese identity, different ways of constructing a relationship with China is one possible way forward. And finally, I will just add that the system, as I've mentioned, has brought great benefits to both sides of the Taiwan Straits. Unraveling or destroying that system for something that is really just of symbolic value is a very risky move. Caution and patience is not such a risky move. I hope that this is something that the leadership in Beijing knows.
So it has been a focal point of tension between China and the US. And China accuses the US for undermining its one China policy.
Right.
And on the US side, US accuses China for escalating the situation. So what's your perspective on this? And what is the essence of the Taiwan issue, and how do you see its future development?
I think it's a truism in political relations of all kinds that both sides can be correct. And that doesn't necessarily tell you whose position is correct. What I mean is that both sides can be accurate in their claims about the other side, but that doesn't necessarily lead to a resolution of the conflict. So in fact, I think that it is true that the United States' position on Taiwan is changing. I think it is also true that China's actions in the Taiwan Straits is not helpful to the situation, but I don't think adopting one's position or the other actually gives us a way forward. Both those claims are true. That doesn't necessarily tell us which position, which side we should favor. When the mainland says this, what they really mean is moves towards de jure independence. That is a declaration of independence. The reality is that Taiwan's political leaders are accountable to the voters who elect them. There are no votes on Taiwan. Well, there may be 1% or 2%. There are no votes on Taiwan for the declaration of de jure independence. Why not? Because people on Taiwan know full well that if they were to do that, the United States would abandon them. The United States would not come to Taiwan's aid. And they know that China would invade. China has said so. In fact, that's now part of Chinese law. So there is no electoral constituency in Taiwan that favors Taiwan independence. Many of them in their heart would perhaps like to see Taiwan be an independent state, but they know that that's politically unworkable. To come back to my comment a few moments ago, this is a very difficult situation. Caution and patience is the right way to proceed. And if that becomes policy, that implies a ratcheting down of tensions. But I do have a suggestion for how to lower the tension and ensure that leaders in China, leaders in Taiwan, leaders in the United States can get on with more pressing business, creating healthy, harmonious, prosperous societies for all three.
So while you were in Taiwan, do you think that the young people, the youngsters in Taiwan, they still feel that culturally or historically connected to the Chinese mainland?
So you've actually put your finger on a really interesting aspect, which is that young people in Taiwan, for the most part, recognize a cultural and historical connection to China, but they do not recognize a political connection to China, and being part of China is not part of their identity. I think that is another way of framing the crux of the problem. It is true that fewer and fewer young people in Taiwan, in my experience, consider reunification as something they strongly desire. So in a sense, there is a gradual drift in identity and thinking away from reunification. I think this is gradual. I think this is reversible. I don't think that this gradual drift is countering this gradual drift is worth the enormous costs of arresting it, of stopping it, of reversing it through direct military action.
So one of the biggest challenges for China and the United States is dealing with the political and psychological factors. And the rising nationalism on both sides has made it even more difficult.
Yeah.
So Chinese scholar Wang
yes.
suggests that the populist sentiment in the US may be aside in the long run. And what's your take on this? How can China and the United States avoid being driven by emotions?
So I think he's right. We know that populism and nationalism rise and fall in different cycles in different countries. In the past, I'm thinking particularly of the Cold War, in the past, a sense of nationalism generated by a strong sense of threat from the outside was a powerful force to unite Americans and motivate Americans to work together and do better. Unfortunately, I don't think it operates in the same way at the moment, for two reasons. One is the entanglement of the world, but also because there is this huge population of Chinese Americans who cannot be allowed to suffer because of the rise of American nationalism. So I wouldn't advocate a return to that model of building popular unity. But I think almost everyone would agree. Many people in my community would agree that what the U.S. really needs to become strong and continue its trajectory of world leadership is to deal seriously and thoughtfully and effectively with its own domestic problems. Anti-Chinese populism, anti-Chinese nationalism is a distraction that certain members of the political elite use to distract from that basic truth, which is that if America wants to lead the world, it has to do so through leadership, not through cutting down and knocking down others. That, again, gives me some optimism. I hope that the American public will realize that and recognize that bashing China is not the solution to America's problems.